So let's begin. Again, the first lecture, the first topic here I want to talk about is gold, gospel, and glory. What motivated Europeans to come to the New World? Now, how many of you have heard this catchphrase before? Gold, gospel, and glory, right? Just out of curiosity, when you think about exploration, which one do you think is most prominent? Gold, all right, yeah. I mean, some sectors they say gospel, but well, we'll see. And what I'm going to try to argue is that actually gold and glory, of course, are very closely connected. But gospel too. I mean, if you remember, you read Todorow's book for today. That first chapter of Todorov makes a pretty compelling argument that Columbus was actually motivated by religious ideas as well. So we'll try to think about how these two are related, because I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think their religious motivations for settlement and economic motivations for settlement often go hand in hand. We tend to structure them, right? We have these, when we teach, right? We have, the economic motivations, the religious motivations, and we often don't think about the way in which they're linked. Now, in order to understand sort of why colonists, or I should say, why Europeans came to the New World, I want to actually go all the way back to, the 12th and the 13th century here. And think about, and moving into again, as you see from the title of the slide, moving into the 15th, 16th, and then even into the 17th century. But I want to start with the Crusades. Now, some of you may know about the Crusades. These were these attempts by the Catholic Church to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. It's sort of religious wars against the Turks, particularly the Seljuk Turks, the Muslims who had taken control of Jerusalem during the 11th century. Pope Urban VI calls for this crusade. Let's rally the troops. Let's head out to the Middle East, to Israel. And he calls for a sort of series of military excursions that are going to reclaim the Holy Land, so to speak. Now, again, the Crusades, at their core, are a religious movement, right? Europeans, let's see if we get a map here. Europeans moving basically from, Western Europe into the Holy Land, and you see, you don't have to really sort of read the map. Some of the print is small, but at the same time, you at least get to see the sort of avenues that they took, the routes that they took. We normally think of the Crusades as a religious movement. What I want to get us to see as well, though, are the sort of economic implications of the Crusades for the colonization of America. So not only are they heading to the Holy Land as sort of, as religious zealots, right? These crusaders. But there are economic implications in the sense that by traveling on these routes that you see here on the map from Western Europe into the Middle East and into the Seljuk Empire there, as you see on the map, these ordinary people, even peasants to some extent, are being exposed to a world that they really never have experienced before. Remember, these peasants are coming out of the feudal system. They're tied to the land. I often tell my students, when did people learn in Western civilization, when did people learn to be ambitious? When did people, I say, how many of you want to make a better life for yourselves? I ask my students, and of course everyone raises their hand. That's why they're sitting in a college classroom, right? They want to make a better life for themselves. But at what point in human history did the idea of making a better life for oneself sort of come into play? Well, most of my students think, universal. Everyone's always wanted, I said, no, they don't. People living in the crusade, in the feudal system in the Middle Ages aren't saying, well, my dad's a peasant, but I'm going to, break away from the farm and I'm going to go get a college education and make something of myself, right? I mean, that's an idea that wouldn't even come into the head of a peasant. His father's teaching him how to work the land for the feudal lord. He will work the land in the same way, as will his children and his children and his children. It's really not till the 15th, 16th, 17th century that you actually see people even thinking about the idea of sort of upward mobility or ambition or educating oneself. Well, what the Crusades does is it gives these peasants and agricultural workers that are bound to the land and for generations, it gives them a reason, a religious reason primarily, to go, to leave home on a religious crusade, to visit worlds that they've never experienced before, to be exposed to different cultures, to be exposed to different ways of thinking, different products, different consumer goods, right? So, again, primarily a religious motivation, but it opens up what we might call a cosmopolitan world to these people, right? They're no longer stuck and bound to the land, but they now experience something that they've never experienced before. Moreover, economically, like I just mentioned, they get exposed to all kinds of goods. Spices, obviously, which are meant to sort of preserve meats, medicine, silk of different types, precious stones, perfumes, all of these things that Europeans, citrus fruits, all of these things that Europeans have never experienced before. So what the Crusades does is creates a mindset that says, there's a world out there. I want to know more about that world. And how can I capitalize on that world? How can I take advantage of that world? How can the East serve us here in the West? And again, you'll see how I'm sort of going to build off this here in a second. Now, if I can go back to the outline that I initially had up there. Once people start moving through, especially the Mediterranean world here, you begin to see people wanting to exploit the East for all of those products that we just mentioned. Trade routes open up throughout the Mediterranean Sea. And there's now going to be competition to see who controls all of those trade routes. And thus we get into what I call here on the outline, trade rivalries between nations. After the Crusades, which again, from a religious point of view, the Crusades largely fail. They don't take the Holy Land away from the Muslims. There's some that are more successful. Some of the Crusades are more successful than others, but they largely fail. The real sort of implications and the legacy of the Crusades is the way in which it opens up all of these trade routes to the East. Europeans want Eastern goods. They don't want to have to pay a middleman, if you will, in order to get them. And as some of you know, who is the middleman that will eventually control a lot of these trade routes? Well, even before that, the Muslims. The Muslims are going to control the trade routes. And then when you get into the 14th, 15th century, you're right. The Italian city-states, Venice and others, are going to control these routes and be very, very powerful economic players in the whole sort of trade route, the course of trade. So, as some of you, it seems, already know, the whole motivation for exploration then is how do we get these goods from the East? How do we access these things without having to go through the Muslims first and then the powerful Italian city-states second? How do we get these goods cheaper? If we can go there directly ourselves and get access to them, we can do that. And let's figure out a way to do that. So the whole process of exploration is really driven by these concerns, which I would argue stem directly from the economic impact of the Crusades. So that's the first point. Any questions on that? Yeah.
My knowledge of the Crusades is less than adequate, probably.
Yeah.
Just what kind of numbers are you talking about over the course of the Crusades? How many people?
Yeah. Again, it varies from crusade to crusade. Sometimes you could have up to 50 to 100,000 people on a particular crusade. Not all of them actually make it to Jerusalem. They get into various wars, little battles along the way. But and it isn't even close to sort of the majority of the European population, or it's probably less than 10% of the American population. But it's a significant portion of the population, and significant enough to be able to shape these kinds of new concerns. I mean, again, think about this. It's hard to sort of explain the way the exposure opens up. I used this term cosmopolitan before. Sort of opens up this world that we in the 21st century, where we're so globally connected, we can't imagine what these crusades do in terms of exposing people to cultures and ways of life and so forth. Yeah.
Isn't that just one of the functions of war in general?
Yeah.
Because you look at Alexander the Great's guys.
Yeah.
Sure, we're sitting on their little island in the middle of the Mediterranean, never dreaming they were going to go to India.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah. I mean, yes and no. I mean, I'm a historian, so I hesitate to make sort of universal statements. That war always produces this. I'd much rather say, well, let's look at the particular context in which it happens. But you're right. War does produce these sort of, let's look at World War I. How do you keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? These American soldiers going to Paris. So certainly there's a universal concept there.
And how do you spread the flu really effectively?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's true. But what I would tend to, I would tend to think about this in terms of the moment, how is this grounded in the particular moment? We have this long, if you want to call it the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, where people are no longer, having these sort of Roman Empire, Alexander the Great, St. Paul or whatever, experiences of traveling through an empire anymore. But most common people are sort of grounded in these sort of local worlds of the feudal system.
And this is also a function then of the beginning of the Renaissance, because you can argue that it also fuels that.
Well, yeah.
Architecture is a prime example.
Absolutely, and you can't talk about these city-states, right, without talking about the way that they patronized the arts and used the wealth that they were getting as the so-called middlemen to promote this. So yeah, there is a sort of cultural exposure that without these trade routes and without the wealth that these trade routes generate, you would not have people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo. You don't have a Da Vinci or a Michelangelo or any of these Renaissance people without money, right? I mean, someone's got to pay them. Someone's got to be their patron. And again, this is all tied to that. So there's a flourishing. There's a sort of cultural flourishing, an economic flourishing of the world that hasn't been seen over the course of the last several hundred years. Or maybe even half a century or half a millennium rather, when the Crusade sort of opens up this whole situation or this whole. Let me say a little bit then about what society or what European society, for those who stayed behind, right? What European society was like in the early modern period. Now, obviously, Europe in the 13th, 14th, 15th, even 16th centuries is an agricultural society. It's limited to that, right? This is a world of limits, the early modern European period. For the most part, people are not experimenting agriculturally. Anyone want to tell me what were they growing largely in Europe? Grains. Yeah, they were growing different forms of grains. Grain is the safest thing you can grow, especially coming off of long periods of disease, Black Death, and so forth. You're not going to be risky in terms of the kinds of things that you're going to grow. You're not going to experiment. You're not going to plant exotic crops and see how they work, because you have a population to feed. And you better make sure there's food available for that population. So again, grain is the safest thing. You plant it during one season of the year. You harvest it the next season. Doesn't take a lot of labor. The diet, is, of course, limited largely to grains among ordinary people. You know, we're not talking here about kings and castles and so forth. We're talking about people like you and me. A lot of breads, a lot of sort of porridge-type foods. Among the poor, you have, popular everyday meal, which may be called water gruel, which I tell my students is, if you take the cream of wheat packet, and you pour it into the water and you sort of stir it up without sort of getting any kind of deep texture to it. It's like water with grain mixed into it. And this was a sort of steady diet during this period. So agriculture, of course, presents a sort of very limited way of thinking about the economy and about food and about everyday life. Now, the economic system of the day during this period is one known as mercantilism. Now, do you study mercantilism with your students? Let's go over this a little bit for those of you who might be a little bit unfamiliar with this. But mercantilism, again, talking about limits, is a very limited economic system, especially when you compare it to, say, capitalism or some modern economic system. Now, under mercantilism, of course, the economy of a particular nation, whether it be England, France, Spain, is controlled by the government. The government has absolute authority over who gets, what's grown, who they trade with, and so forth. So again, government control. Again, these are mostly sort of absolutist states, which means that what the government says goes. Usually a monarch of some type. There are no sort of constitutions. There are no sort of constitutional rights. England is, of course, the rare example of this, with the sort of limited monarchy controlled by Parliament, keeping the king in check, although that doesn't always work out very well, but at least that's the ideal. So again, strong absolute governments, they're going to have complete control over the economy, what gets traded, what not. Now, how is wealth measured in a mercantile economy? How do you know if you're rich, if you're a rich, wealthy country?
Size of your army?
Well, your size of your army, how are you going to get a big army? You got to pay them, right? Gold, silver, specie, if you want to call it that, precious metals, and so forth. So wealth is completely measured by this. This is what I mean by when I say mercantilism is a limited form of economy, right? The economy does not sort of expand and contract like under capitalism, right? There's no systems of credit and so forth. There is a finite amount of wealth in the world. And the way you get that wealth and you access that finite amount of wealth is, to put it crudely, you dig it up. You find it and you dig it up, or maybe someone else has it and you go in and take it away from them, as in the Spanish model, which we'll talk about here in a second, right, that you read about. But again, it's, once all the gold and silver and metals are dug up, that's it. Your economy sort of stops. It's sort of a zero-sum game. That's all you have, right? The economy can't expand any further. So when you have this sort of system of wealth, you either A, need to dig up wealth, or B, get it, whether by force or through trade, with somebody else. Which then leads to the third major principle of mercantilism. Government control was the first. Wealth measured by specie, the second. Which leads to the third major principle, and probably the most important principle in mercantilism. You want to have a favorable balance of trade. Right? You want to be exporting more than you're importing. Obviously. Now here's the problem. Refresh my memory again. What's everybody growing? Grain, right? So, the King of England can't get on the proverbial cell phone with the King of France and say, hey, Louis, I got some good grain for you here. You ready to fork over some of your gold to get it? Right? Louis would laugh in his face and say, we got enough grain. We're all growing grain. You can't, I'm not going to give up my gold. The key is, if you can't dig up gold, you have to figure out, you have to have some kind of product that other monarchs will want, whether to satisfy their people or satisfy their nobles, so they can maintain power. You need to have some other product that they want that they're willing to give up, and this is sort of crudely put, but give up their sort of, precious metals in order to get, because there's such a demand for that product. The problem is everybody's growing grain. No one has any products like this, at least in continental Europe and in England. Which then, of course, you see where we're going here, leads to the sort of fourth point of what mercantilism is all about. Colonies are essential to mercantilism, because if you don't have that product, perhaps you can go somewhere else in the world, gain political control over that territory, and thus find it. If you're lucky, like the Spanish, although the Spanish, saw this as sort of providential, right? God, this was God. But, if you're lucky, like the Spanish, you'll show up and you'll start exploring, and you'll actually, if you run into the Aztecs, who we'll talk about here in a second, you conquer the Aztecs and take their gold, or you can do what they did with the Incas. You can enslave the entire population and make them work in the silver mines for hundreds of years in order to dig up the gold. But not everybody is as lucky as the Spanish. The French do actually pretty well, not with gold, not in terms of finding gold, but in terms of Native Americans trading skins, right, and so forth, that become wildly popular. They're successful in this, not as successful as the Spanish, but these kinds of furs that they're able to tap into from their possessions in what today is Canada become all the craze in Europe, and this allows them to have a sort of profitable economy.
They also had sugarcane in the Caribbean that they were also doing.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to get to next. Both the French and the English tap into sugar in the Caribbean. A little bit later, the English actually fails very early to come up with some type of colonial. In the 1500s and 1600s, the English are a little bit behind the eight ball here in terms of catching up with the North American mercantile sort of markets. When the English try some of their initial colonization schemes, particularly up in Nova Scotia and places like this, they think, well, we're going to find gold. They realize that doesn't work. And then they're like, well, we'll conquer the Indians, and they must have some gold. No, they don't. These are eastern woodland peoples. They don't have these sort of civilizations that the Aztecs do. They're scattered throughout the region. Same thing in Jamestown and so forth. The disappointment of the English. Eventually, the English, the French, even the Dutch, to some extent, will tap into Caribbean slave trade. So, again, let me sort of take a little bit of a sort of detour here. Think about the colonies, the British colonies, right? Again, we tend to think about the 13 colonies because they ultimately feed into the Revolution, right? In many ways, that is what we might call an ahistorical or a bad way of thinking historically about the world of the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. Because, if we tend to look from hindsight and think, well, the only colonies I want that are important to me, because, history, after all, they tell us, which I'm not sure I agree with this, but they tell us the only purpose for studying history is for civics, right? The only purpose for studying history is so that we can make people better citizens of the United States, right? Well, if you're going to come at history that way, then you have a problem incorporating some of the ways in which the economic system really worked in the 17th century. Right? In the 17th century, the jewel of the British Empire in the Western Hemisphere was not Virginia or Massachusetts Bay or New York. It was Barbados, right? It was St. Kitts. It was Bermuda. It was maybe not as much Bermuda because there wasn't a lot of sugar going on there. There was some. It was these kinds of places. It was Jamaica, because there they were producing sugar, which was the wealthiest. You made the most money off of this. Now, again, we tend to, focus on Jamestown, right? In 1612 or 13, this guy, John Rolfe, plants tobacco, and, it becomes the great staple crop, and the rest is history. Jamestown took off and so forth. But the tobacco market, while it saves the colony of Virginia, it's nothing in terms of size when compared to the sugar plantations. So, how are we thinking about colonial America? I always ask my students, right? Why should we study colonial America? Why is it important? Let me ask you, why is it important to study colonial America? Why do you tell your kids it's important to study colonial America? Yeah.
I tell my kids they need to study colonial America so they can understand what languages they're speaking in the classroom.
Okay.
Here in Palm Beach County, we have French,
Okay.
Spanish, and English.
Good.
So
Yeah.
Where these first things were planted. And
Right.
why we ended up with this
Okay.
Constitution.
Okay. That's the answer I usually get, right? That's, you can't understand the United States and the government and, America, meaning the United States of America, without understanding the colonies. Now, that's right? Obviously, that's correct. But it is a little bit, again, sort of ahistorical, because then, if your purpose for studying the colonies is simply to show how we, in the present day, understand, how America was made, the United States was made, then what do you do with the West Indies? Which, if you really want to take your students into the world of colonization and understand the world as it is, if you're thinking about the colonies for the sake of the colonies, people walking around in, 1620 aren't thinking like, well, we're 1622, right? We're starting a House of Burgesses here. This is going to be, I could see in 150 some odd years, we're going to have a nation. It's going to be a representative government. No, they were part of this larger British mercantile world. And they were a minor part of it compared to, say, the Caribbean, right? So, but we don't incorporate the Barbados and Jamaica and so forth in because they don't fit our civics-minded understanding of, and again, the challenge, I would say, is, while history for civics is good in some ways, sometimes history for civics can become very ahistorical because we only pick and choose what's appropriate. That gets us to where we want to go. Hey, Barbados doesn't work because that doesn't help my kids become better American citizens, right? Who cares about sugar plantations? And they didn't side with the American Revolution. They're out. They're taken out of the narrative, right? They're not part of the storyline. We tend to talk about leaving Indians and slaves and so forth out of the narrative, but you can also leave anything that doesn't relate to the American Revolution. They call this a Whig interpretation of the American Revolution, because everything in the colonies that's important is something that connects with the nation. And it's really a bad way of thinking about history. Civics and history are two different sort of disciplines. If you want to teach your kids historical thinking, you need to see the North America as part of this very European world. The United States has nothing to do with it yet. You want to get them to see the way in which these systems developed as they would have in that time period, rather than superimposing our presentist ideas about why they're important on the past. Let's talk about the Spanish conquest, right? How and why are the Spanish, what is it, what does Todorov say? Roughly about 500 or so Spaniards. How do they pull this thing off? Has to be one of the most provocative questions in the study of early colonization. I hope that at some point in your 5th and 8th grade classrooms you actually ask that to your students. How did they pull this off? Rather than giving them all the facts and stuff, and let the debate flow. 5th graders can do this. They can, it might get a little crazy and you're going to have to rein it in at times. But how and why is this possible? Now, the sort of storyline, right, is that Hernando Cortez establishes the Spanish establish a beachhead in Cuba. Cortez is the mayor, or is it governor of the Spanish settlement in Cuba. And Cuba becomes sort of a sort of launching point, as well as other West Indian islands, becomes sort of a launching point for the move into the Mexico Valley. Cortez, I'm just looking at my notes here. Cortez is the mayor or alcalde of Santiago, Cuba, and again, roughly 500-600 men he's going to take. After several military skirmishes on the outskirts of the Aztec Empire, he's eventually noticed by Moctezuma, who is the prince, who is the emperor, if you will, of the Aztec Empire. This eventually will lead to a face-to-face meeting, of course, as we know, between Cortez and Moctezuma, and of course the eventual overthrow of the Aztec Empire in 1521 by the Spanish. So how does he pull this off? Well, first of all, you have obvious military considerations, right? Spanish firearms, cannons are no match for Native American spears and other forms of weaponry. You know, this is the sort of logical, natural answer to the question. Most of you, if you ask this to your students, they will immediately respond this way. European technology trumps Native American technology. And in some sort of macro way, that is correct. Obviously, the Western civilization has developed technology that the Native American civilizations are not able to counter. But there are other reasons, too. I would hate to just leave it as a sort of military conquest. As we know, Cortez is, as much as sometimes you're appalled by Cortez, right? You have to give Cortez some credit. I mean, the guy is a sort of an anthropologist as well as a military man. I mean, he's able to study and understand this culture, in a way that is just sometimes amazing to me, that he's so quickly able to pick up on the myths that this culture upholds, the belief systems, and then exploit those systems, for good or for bad. I mean, he is somewhat of a genius when it comes to this. He immediately realizes that not everybody in the Aztec Empire is happy in the Aztec Empire. So he quickly exploits the political divisions, the underlying political divisions, to quickly side with some of these disgruntled ethnic groups and tribes to oppose Moctezuma. So the Spanish invasion, of course, or conquest of the Aztec Empire is not just the Spanish, you realize. I mean, they are also supported and given a lot of what today we might call intelligence from some of these disgruntled ethnic groups. Disease plays a significant role here, especially the spread of smallpox, which the Spanish sort of bring with them. By the time Cortez comes into Tenochtitlan and has this meeting with Moctezuma, smallpox is spreading throughout the entire city, which is sort of obviously weakening the city and so forth, which is, cannons are one thing, but, when people are dying from disease and so forth, this obviously makes your job a whole lot easier, especially when you only have 500 or 600 men. But what's interesting about Todorov's book, and I think what's interesting about other books on this, is we tend to overlook the fact that the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, it was in many ways a clash of religious worldviews. And again, we need to sift through Todorov to get this. But in many ways, again, Cortez understands this. Moctezuma, for example, believes that Cortez is who? Quetzalcoatl, yeah. I mean, that Cortez is the sort of human embodiment of, and interestingly enough, right about the time that certain Aztec prophets are predicting the return of Quetzalcoatl, Cortez shows up. Now, this is not as dramatic as you think it is, because they're predicting the return of Quetzalcoatl all the time, right? So it's not as if, the one prediction that's ever been made that Quetzalcoatl, no, I mean, this, Moctezuma is a deeply religious man, deeply embedded within the Aztec traditions. thus he takes, one of the criticisms of Moctezuma is that he listens, and this is true, he listens more to his religious advisors than he does to his military advisors when Cortez makes his move. Meanwhile, Cortez, even though he's not Protestant, but he's Catholic, but he's European, and even European Catholicism offers a certain amount of sort of free will, right? I mean, there's God. God is controlling. God is sovereign and so forth. But he gives human beings, both Catholic and Protestant theology teaches this, free will to act. So Cortez is also a religious man. He's in the sense that he's sort of informed by the Catholicism that we talked about, the Counter-Reformation Catholicism of Europe. But this still offers him the ability to like all of us, to manipulate, to change course, to make decisions on the fly, to use his free will. What's fascinating about the Aztecs and Moctezuma is so bound by this view of the gods that's almost a sort of providential view, we'll call it, in which everything is tailored by the gods. There is very little free will because everything that happens must happen because one of the gods ordained this to happen. So, as Todorov points out and other historians, Moctezuma, because of his religious convictions, is sort of almost paralyzed to act because he feels, well, this is, here comes Cortez. My religious advisors are telling me this is Quetzalcoatl, and this is what it is. This is how it is. This is happening now. I am just a sort of woeful human participant in this grand event. I cannot change the course of history because ultimately the gods are shaping the course of history, which freezes him, which paralyzes him. Now again, from a 21st perception, stupid, right? Why aren't you doing anything? Why aren't you acting sooner to stop this threat? But again, understand the world in which Moctezuma came from, or get your students to understand that world. Why he would be frozen, why he would think, this is some kind of major divine event that's taking place that I have no control over. Now, of course, his military advisors are probably being bad religious people and telling him, forget about that. We got Cortez coming down the pike here. Let's do something about this. Let's mobilize. Let's stop this so-called God from coming in and taking us over. But Moctezuma always says no. And of course, this is ultimately going to result in his own death, or maybe even from the perspective of Moctezuma, his own martyrdom, right, for upholding his own religious beliefs. Again, this is one view. I find it to at least be sort of intellectually fascinating. Whether or not that fully explains this, we might want to go back to the sort of basic, crude position that says cannons and guns always defeat spears, and that's why this happened. But even with that, you still need to get around the idea that 500 guns versus 500,000 people. There's some other issues there that at least need to be addressed. And I think the religious motivation, the political motivations of Cortez explain some of this. Well, this then, again, raises another question of, we tend to think of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, right? And in some ways, if we think about it that way, we'd be right, right? The Spanish come in, they take over the city, they make this a sort of Spanish province in the New World. They do the same thing to the Incas and so forth with Pizarro. But how do we define conquest? What do we mean by conquest? When we use the word sort of conquest, we often think of a military conquest or some type of a political conquest, which in this sense, what the Spanish did to the Aztecs certainly was that. But was it a sort of complete conquest? Was it a cultural conquest, I guess, is the question that a lot of historians of this period are now asking. The political and the military conquest, that storyline's been around for hundreds of years. This goes back to the original question about the writers, about the historians of this. They're writing this as a great political and military conquest, as by 1522. A year after the conquest, people are already starting to write histories on it. But what about this as a sort of cultural conquest? And what I mean by that is, how much was European culture? How much did that impact the everyday lives and the rituals and the religion and the sort of day-to-day life of the Aztecs that were conquered? And can we have a military and political conquest without a cultural conquest? I guess is the question that I'm trying to get at here in this last point about.
Are you asking it rhetorically, or do you really want to?
Well, I'm asking rhetorically, and now I'm going to try to answer it. Yeah, although you can help me. Yeah. Well, what do you think? Yeah, we got a little time here. What do you?
No.
Yeah.
Bishop Delano, when he goes to burn all the books, it's out of frustration.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, is this a conquest? Is this a culture? Let me give you some facts, and that's my spur your thinking a little bit here. Let me be provocative and raise a few things here. Of course, the Spanish view this in terms of total conquest, right? Religious, economic, political. This is a very European thing to do. We have conquered the Aztecs. And again, I want to explore here less, again, about the sort of government structures they do and the way they exploit the gold for mercantilism, and think about it in terms of the religious and in some ways, cultural overthrow. Part of conquering the Aztecs is to make them Catholics, to Christianize them. We forget this. The conquest is not complete until all of European civilization has been imposed upon these natives, and they become European, which of course means they need to be civilized, quote unquote, as the Europeans would understand civilization. And of course, European civilization, or the civilizing process, is directly related to Christianity. So again, friars, Dominican, Franciscan, some Jesuit. If you've ever seen I think it's Robert De Niro, the movie The Mission, right? You show some clips to your students. Great sort of way of capturing some of this. But these friars go into this new world with what I called before this sort of millennial zeal. Many of the Spanish missionaries believe that, and really it becomes a missionary endeavor. The conquest gets after Cortez, dies and the generations go on, the conquest really becomes a missionary conquest now, to convert these people. But these people these friars, again, driven by this sort of millennialism, they believe that by converting the world, by bringing everybody into the Catholic Church, they will somehow usher in the return of Jesus Christ. They will usher in the kingdom of God through this. So they're operating not only in terms of getting these Indian souls saved, but they believe that there's this sort of, their views on the millennium, it's often referred to as post-millennialism. In other words, God will come and establish his 1,000-year reign on the earth after enough people become Christian, or after people become Catholic, in this case. So there is this sort of urgency there. And there are some early successes by these missionaries. Indians are converted, in a lot of them in mass numbers, within the first decade after the conquest. Now, again, what does that mean? What is a conversion? Now if you go up to like Massachusetts Bay 100 years later, a conversion means you need to see your sinfulness. You need to understand that you can do nothing. This is the Protestant, Calvinist, Puritan version of conversion, right? You have to see your sinfulness and understand that there's nothing you can do to be saved in and of yourself. You need to understand the grace of God who died on the cross for your sins, who paid the price for your sin. You need to believe in the resurrection. You need to accept Jesus as your Savior. That's a more modern way of describing it, but that, and then you need to read the Bible. You need to learn how to read so you can understand the Bible. It's complicated to be converted under a Protestant system. And again, I don't mean this stereotypical of any religion, Catholic or Protestant, but I'm talking here as a historian. If you look at the way the Catholics tried to convert, a conversion simply means you teach them that, their God is false, and you teach them basically how to cross themselves, do the sign of the cross, and then make them come to church every Sunday. And that becomes ultimately a sort of what a conversion is going to be. Very basic understanding of God and Jesus Christ. Cross yourself, and of course, I forgot, be baptized, right? And then, so there's no sort of, the Puritans have much harder work when they convert, when they try to convert some of these Eastern Algonquin Indians, like the Wampanoag or the Abenaki Indians or whoever they happen to run into. It's much more difficult for them. So the Spanish can have sort of mass conversions, where in large groups these Indians sort of, all sort of convert, and that's a sign of progress, that the spiritual conquest is going on. And we often don't think about the way in which they're linked. Now, in order to understand sort of why colonists, or I should say why Europeans came to the New World, I want to actually go all the way back to the 12th and the 13th century here, and think about and moving into again, as you see from the title of the slide, moving into the 15th, 16th, and then even into the 17th century. But I want to start with the Crusades. Now, some of you may know about the Crusades. These were these attempts by the Catholic Church to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. Sort of religious wars against the Turks, particularly the Seljuk Turks, the Muslims who had taken control of Jerusalem during the 11th century. Pope Urban VI calls for this crusade. Let's rally the troops. Let's head out to the Middle East, to Israel, and he calls for a sort of series of military excursions that are going to reclaim the Holy Land, so to speak. Now, again, the Crusades, at their core, are a religious movement, right? Europeans, let's see if we get a map. When did people learn to be ambitious? When did people, I say, how many of you want to make a better life for yourselves? I ask my students, and of course, everyone raises their hand. That's why they're sitting in a college classroom, right? They want to make a better life for themselves. But at what point in human history did the idea of making a better life for oneself sort of come into play? Well, most of my students think, universal. Everyone's always wanted, I said, no, they don't. People living in the crusade, in the feudal system in the Middle Ages aren't saying, well, my dad's a peasant, but I'm going to, break away from the farm and I'm going to go get a college education and make something of myself, right? I mean, that's an idea that wouldn't even come into the head of a peasant. His father's teaching him how to work the land for the feudal lord. He will work the land in the same way, as will his children and his children and his children. It's really not till, the 15th, 16th, 17th century that you actually see people even thinking about the idea of sort of upward mobility or ambition or educating oneself. Well, what the Crusades does is it gives these peasants and agricultural workers that are bound to the land and for generations, so let's begin. Again, the first lecture, the first topic here I want to talk about is gold, gospel, and glory. What motivated Europeans to come to the New World? Now, how many of you have heard this catchphrase before? Gold, gospel, and glory, right? Just out of curiosity, when you think about exploration, which one do you think is most prominent? Gold, all right, yeah. I mean, some sectors they say gospel, but we'll see. And what I'm going to try to argue is that actually gold and glory, of course, are very closely connected. But gospel too. I mean, if you remember, you read Todorow's book for today. That first chapter of Todorov makes a pretty compelling argument that Columbus was actually motivated by religious ideas as well. So we'll try to think about how these two are related, because I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think their religious motivations for settlement and economic motivations for settlement often go hand in hand. We tend to structure them, right? We have these, when we teach, right? We have, the economic motivations, the religious motivations here. Europeans moving basically from, Western Europe into the Holy Land, and you see, you don't have to really sort of read the map. Some of the print is small, but at the same time, you at least get to see the sort of avenues that they took, the routes that they took. We normally think of the Crusades as a religious movement. What I want to get us to see as well, though, are the sort of economic implications of the Crusades for the colonization of America. So not only are they heading to the Holy Land as sort of, as religious zealots, right? These crusaders. But there are economic implications in the sense that by traveling on these routes that you see here on the map from Western Europe into the Middle East and into the Seljuk Empire there, as you see on the map, these ordinary people, even peasants to some extent, are being exposed to a world that they really never have experienced before. Remember, these peasants are coming out of the feudal system. They're tied to the land. I often tell my students, when do people learn in Western civilization? It gives them a reason, a religious reason primarily, to leave home on a religious crusade, to visit worlds that they've never experienced before, to be exposed to different cultures, to be exposed to different ways of thinking, different products, different consumer goods, right? So, again, primarily a religious motivation, but it opens up what we might call a cosmopolitan world to these people, right? They're no longer stuck and bound to the land, but they now experience something that they've never experienced before. Moreover, economically, like I just mentioned, they get exposed to all kinds of goods. Spices, obviously, which are meant to sort of preserve meats, medicine, silk of different types, precious stones, perfumes, all of these things that Europeans, citrus fruits, all of these things that Europeans have never experienced before. So what the Crusades does is creates a mindset that says, there's a world out there. I want to know more about that world. And how can I capitalize on that world?